get straight to our next guest. Michael Frazis is joining us in studio. He knows his stuff about vaccines. Michael, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Credit where credit is due. You must be feeling a bit like the cat who swallowed the canary today. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you increased your positioning in Moderna ahead of this announcement today.
We did. We doubled it on the back of the Pfizer news, actually. Because, it was really kind of a proof of concept. I mean, there's actually been a lot of data throughout the year. A lot of data that showed that these vaccines generated, antibody response. Been very, very strange if that did not result in, people actually being vaccinated. But now we've got two studies, the Russians are pretty convinced that they have a third that have shown this works. And obviously Moderna has, several advantages. I'm not sure if you discussed on the show yet today.
Tell us what you see as Moderna's advantages.
Well, the Pfizer one has to be refrigerated at minus 80 degrees, which is possible. It's not, an insurmountable hurdle. It's obviously much more expensive and much more difficult to get around. That's probably the main advantage. The other one is obviously the efficacy is higher. So they're kind of 95% effective.
Yeah.
But really, you don't actually need that high efficacy to have an effective vaccine. Even if it was much lower, you'd still be able to cut those chains of transmission. Now, the downside of Moderna is it's more expensive. But, if it's $30, $40, $50 versus, $10, $20, it doesn't really matter. Like, think of how much the coronavirus has already cost us.
Yeah.
These are small numbers.
And the fact is that there's already been orders placed. I mean, the US and Canada have placed more orders for the Moderna vaccine than any other country. I think Canada has bought 1 dose per head of population, essentially. So Moderna today, I read through the report, it's saying by the end of 2020, the company expects to have approximately 20 million doses of the vaccine ready to ship in the US. Remains on track to manufacture 500 million to 1 billion doses globally in 2021. So the question is, if you're late to this Moderna story, does that give you still enough reason to invest in the company even now when we saw the share price rise by about 10% overnight?
It's a tough one. I mean, you can kind of do the numbers pretty quickly in your head, right? There's 1 billion doses and it's, I guess, maybe $35 US per dose. There'll be all kinds of discounts and things like that. Look, I think Moderna's a long-term play, but to be honest, you probably should have bought it, 6 months ago. I think we're up 5 times on our investment now. So I wouldn't necessarily advocate rushing in, but I think it's a moment where you can just pause and reflect. Like, this was such a phenomenal achievement. And it really shows kind of the power of commerce, and in this case, policy working together to surmount a very difficult, hurdle.
Mm-hmm. What about the other players out there? Now, of course, Pfizer announced its results last week, but AstraZeneca is still in the pipeline as well. Is there a thematic you could go and play that potentially if it goes and releases good results when it comes to efficacy? Yeah,
I think it's harder. I think Pfizer and AstraZeneca were hard to play because this is only a small part of what they do, and they're pricing their vaccines much lower. It's going to be very hard for these companies to move the needle. These are enormous pharmaceutical companies, so they're unlikely to make a lot of money out of the vaccine. For Moderna, this is a big deal. Like, this is their lead program, and their entire kind of pipeline of drug candidates, vaccine candidates, is based on mRNA, is based on the same foundational technology. So this actually validates their entire pipeline as well as their lead candidate. So it's a much, much bigger deal for Moderna. I think if you wanted to play the vaccine story, you wouldn't go to AstraZeneca or Pfizer. You'd probably go into travel or try and figure out the winners and losers in this environment.
Well, what about CSL? We were just speaking with David Lane from Pitcher Partners, who was saying locally CSL is a longer term play when it comes to vaccine. We had that announcement yesterday involving the federal government. I mean, do you look favorably on CSL?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not as high a return opportunity as would usually look at, but it's a rock solid company. They will benefit from this. They will be manufacturing a lot of vaccines, and I think the entire life sciences sector is going to benefit from this. It's been a huge amount of investment. Talented students are going to be flocking to the industry in a way they never have before. It's a really exciting place to be, and CSL is obviously the market leader in Australia. Yeah,
interesting. Really early in the COVID piece, so we're talking March, I remember speaking with somebody who invests in biotechs, and they were saying traditionally, vaccine research has not been lucrative. Therefore, a lot of these companies have not been that involved. So you sense that there will be a change now, given the pandemic that we are still, suffering through in the US in particular, many parts of the world?
Well, I think this is one of those parts of research and development that's best done by policy in most cases. There isn't a huge pot of gold. It's very hard to actually get people to take vaccines, surprisingly, even ones that are, been around for a century plus. I think this is very good for the whole industry in the sense it'll attract a lot more government funding. It's very obvious why you need research and money to flow into this area. And I think a lot more smart people will be attracted to it. So I think the vaccine research and development will benefit hugely. Whether or not a bunch of companies invest in it. And what's actually likely to happen is the companies that have invested huge amounts in developing coronavirus treatments and vaccines are not going to make any money out of it. They're not going to get a return on those dollars. All those second, third, fourth tier biotech hopefuls who pivoted to coronavirus and found things that might be effective, well, those treatments are unlikely to be approved in time. There's a good chance significant numbers of people are vaccinated for, $20 or $40, very little.
So they won't need nasal sprays that are being, developed by smaller sort of biotech companies.
That is what usually happens. That's why everyone was so slow off the mark. It's because every time there's a new epidemic scare, everybody invests huge amounts of money, often ordering hundreds of millions of dollars of doses of treatment or something, only for the epidemic to flame out before anybody makes any money out of that. It's one of the reasons everyone was so slow off the mark. Now, this was just the one that actually did flare up into a globally significant event. But yeah, it's an interesting time to be in the space.
Yeah, really interesting.
Michael, we're seeing a lot of investors are switching back into cyclical areas. You mentioned the travel and tourism stocks in particular, potentially has some upside there. But what we're seeing is a lot of that switching out of those growth names, particularly the online space that benefited during this pandemic period. It's one of those questions that a lot of people are pondering now is this an opportunity to go and get back into these stocks at lower levels? What's your thoughts on that?
Look, I think you've got to go case by case. And there's no doubt some of the e-commerce players run really hard. For example, Shopify, pretty early investors in that. It was a very successful investment, but it got to 40, 50 times sales. Phenomenal company, but we traded out of that for better opportunities. And I think now these companies are down, 15, 20%, but it's not really enough. It's not enough for them to get exciting. I think now you want to be looking forward and trying to find the best places to be over the next 1, 2, and 3 years. And that's where the best returns will come.
So we have been, hanging on all this vaccine news. It's been doing its job when it comes to enthusiasm and risk appetite. Do you think that a vaccine and the likelihood of it being distributed starting at the end of this year into 2021 is now priced in?
No, I don't think it'd be priced into travel. I think a recovery is starting to be priced in, but a world where all this pent-up demand just hits at once, which will happen. Yeah. We'll all visit our relatives, we'll go visit our friends overseas, all those trips that were delayed, all that money that was spent on e-commerce will now be redirected to restaurants and travel. That is absolutely not priced in.
Yeah, and not even particularly in regards to travel, but I'm thinking in regards to vaccine headlines. I mean, if we get another sort of update coming from, what's another company? Not Pfizer, AstraZeneca, or Novavax, or whatever, will that help spur such enthusiasm?
Yeah, I think every additional vaccine will probably have less of an impact now. I think it's very clear that these vaccines will be there. That is the reality. So you just got to accept that and make what changes you need to make.
Well, look, here's to a vaccine. Here's to everybody accepting the science behind vaccines and moving forward from this pandemic. All right, Michael, great to have you in, as always.
Thanks for having me
Thank
on.
you. Cheers. Michael Frazis there joining us in studio.